My name is Captain Emily Carter, United States Army Civil Affairs. The phone on the worn pine table wouldn't stop buzzing, rattling like an insect court in a glass jar. 10 missed calls from my mother, 7 from my father, a final warning that my voicemail was full. I stared at the screen and let it ring. They were calling from Miami Beach, furious and entitled, sipping margaritas by a hotel pool while their world quietly collapsed. What they didn't know, what they couldn't imagine, was that their credit cards had already been frozen. Their accounts were locked. A process was in motion that would strip them of everything they thought they deserved. They believed this was just another family squabble. It wasn't. It was the execution of my grandfather's final plan. 24 hours earlier, I'd walked through that same front door in Nashville, Tennessee, duffel bag slung over my shoulder, boots still dusted with the pale grit of Iraq. I hadn't told anyone I was coming back early. My goal had been simple: surprise them. Especially my grandmother, who I hadn't hugged in almost 2 years. But the house felt wrong. Silent. The kind of silence that doesn't belong in a home, but in a hospital wing at night. My steps echoed as I moved down the hallway, each one heavier than the last. At the back of the house, I found her. Grandma Evelyn. The curtains were drawn, the air stale. She looked so frail, her breath shallow, skin pale against the pillow. On the nightstand, a full glass of water sat just inches out of reach. That image, so small, so cruel, broke me more than anything I'd seen in a war zone. I pulled out my phone, and with a sick certainty, I knew what I'd find. Scrolling through social media, there they were. My parents, Thomas and Linda Carter, grinning under the Florida sun. Drinks in their hands, the ocean at their backs. The caption, "Living our best life." Miami days, no worries. The contrast hit like a bullet. Their mother, my grandmother, was slipping away, alone in a dark room, while they toasted paradise. My chest burned with rage, but it wasn't wild, it wasn't reckless. It was cold. Clear. The kind of rage that makes decisions sharp. This wasn't neglect. It was betrayal. And suddenly, my grandfather's words came back to me. Words he'd whispered years ago in his garage while teaching me how to mend a fishing reel. Legacy isn't about money, Em. Legacy is a promise. A promise you keep, even when it's hard. That night, as I sat beside my grandmother's bed, listening to the faint rattle of her breathing, I realized why he had trusted me with his secrets. Why he had prepared me, not my parents, for this moment. Because he knew. He knew they would fail her. And he knew I wouldn't. If you want to understand how we got here, you need to know about my family's orbit. At the center of it all was my brother, Ryan Carter. Ryan had always been their golden boy. The son who could do no wrong, even when he did. His life was a string of flashy ventures and spectacular failures, but no matter how badly things went, my parents bailed him out. For them, Ryan's charm wasn't just a personality trait, it was currency. The rest of us? We were satellites. Expected to circle him quietly, reflecting his light without generating any of our own. The memory that still burns in me happened the night before my last deployment. A family dinner at a restaurant in downtown Nashville, meant to be a farewell in my honor. But like always, the spotlight found Ryan. Halfway through the meal, he stood up dramatically and announced he'd secured seed money for his latest business venture, an app for pet owners that had no real business plan. My mother gasped with delight, clasping her hands together as though he'd just won a Nobel Prize. My father raised his glass, his pride spilling over as though Ryan had invented fire. I sat there stirring my iced tea, watching the scene unfold, that familiar heaviness pressing into me. Because I knew this play by heart. When I'd brought home my college acceptance letter years earlier, their response had been a distracted, "That's nice, honey." When I'd been awarded an army scholarship, my father had scoffed. "Waste of brains. Why throw yourself at government work?" When I'd finished my first marathon, my mother had glanced up briefly from her phone before saying, "Don't run too much, it's bad for your knees." Every achievement of mine was met with silence. But Ryan's pipe dreams, his next big things, were celebrated like national holidays. That night at the restaurant, I tried to bridge the gap. I cleared my throat and began to explain my role in civil affairs. Not just a soldier, but someone entrusted with rebuilding war-torn communities, overseeing legal and financial reconstruction, managing millions in aid. It was the kind of responsibility most people couldn't imagine. I thought maybe, just maybe, this would make them proud. My father chuckled, reached across the table, and patted my hand. His voice was soft, almost patronizing. "That's nice, sweetheart. Try not to get your uniform too dirty. All that college just to go play in the sand." The words burned. Play in the sand. 6 months later, those words echoed in my head as I sat inside a sweltering command tent in Mosul, Iraq. Generators rattled outside. Around me sat local leaders, international aid workers, and my commanding officer, Colonel Hayes, a man who didn't care about charm or appearances, only results. We'd just uncovered a contractor siphoning money meant for a water treatment facility. The project's collapse would have destabilized the entire province. Tension filled the air, voices overlapping, tempers flaring. I raised my hand, calm and deliberate, my voice cutting through the noise. "The documentation is clear. Funds have been misused. We have the authority to freeze them immediately under fiduciary negligence. We act now, or this project collapses." The room fell silent. Colonel Hayes studied me for a long moment, then gave one firm nod. And in that nod, in that small gesture of trust, I felt more respect than I had earned from my father in 27 years. Because Hayes saw me, not as a distraction, not as someone playing in the sand, but as a professional, as a leader. That steel inside me, the resilience my parents dismissed, had been forged years earlier by another man entirely. My grandfather, Henry Carter. Grandpa Henry believed in quiet tools, sharpened pencils, oiled hinges, clean ledgers. When I was 12, he taught me how to square a checkbook the way other kids learned jump shots. "Numbers are just promises wearing uniforms," he'd say, tapping the margin with a calloused finger. "If you keep your promises, the numbers salute." Back then it sounded like one of his country aphorisms. Sitting beside Grandma Evelyn's bed, the oxygen machine sighing like patient surf, it felt like doctrine. By dawn I had already moved from fury to function. I brewed a pot of coffee, called a private nursing agency in Brentwood, Tennessee, and arranged round-the-clock care to start that afternoon. I texted an old medic from my unit to ask about reputable hospice teams in the area and made a short list. Action first, outrage later. That was the civil affairs way: stabilize the system, then chase the rot. When the nurse arrived, gentle and efficient, I slipped down the hall to my grandfather's study. The room still smelled like cedar and pipe tobacco, a soft remnant of the man who'd built cabinets with his own hands and an investment portfolio with the same patience. Sunlight slanted across the desk, catching dust motes in parade formation. I ran my palm across the blotter, then reached for the bookcase. The trick was an old family secret. Lift the collected Faulkner by the spine, tilt it 15 degrees, and the case would sigh forward on hidden casters. Behind it, recessed in the wall, sat a steel safe the colour of storm clouds. Grandpa had let me spin the dial once when I was a kid. Not to open it, just to feel the weight of something that matters. I didn't need a sticky note for the combination. It was his kind of poetry. The 17th of May 1999, the day would court a smallmouth bass together on the hearthrug, and I'd insisted we release it. Some things you preserve, he told me, smiling. So other things can grow. The tumblers clicked. The door swung on silent hinges. Inside, no dragon's hoard, just stacks of labeled folders, a slim fireproof box, and his green ledger, edges rubbed smooth by years of faithful arithmetic. I lifted the ledger first. On the title page, in his precise hand, he'd written, "A legacy equals promise." Nothing else. The rest was numbers, dates, neat annotations in blue ink. Below the ledger lay the documents that changed everything. The will, yes, with its familiar notary seal. The durable powers of attorney for health and finances that named my father, Thomas, as primary. But clipped to those was a short addendum typed on thick paper and stamped twice, successor fiduciary provision. In Henry's tidy marginalia, if duty is neglected, duty is reassigned. My breath hitched. I kept reading. The provision outlined specific thresholds, missed medical appointments, cancelled in-home care without replacement, personal use of any funds designated for Evelyn's support. Should any of those occur, the primary fiduciaries would be suspended and authority would pass immediately and irrevocably to the named successor, Captain Emily Jane Carter. At the back of the file was a sealed envelope addressed in his blocky script, a break glass only when the water rises. I opened it with my thumb, careful not to tear the paper. Inside was a 2-page directive, his version of a battle plan, titled Contingency Protocol, Family Care. It listed contacts, a preferred law firm in Franklin, and, chillingly, a checklist for securing liquid assets if negligence were proven. There was also a note, only 3 lines. M. If you're reading this, I was right to trust your spine. Execute the plan. Protect your grandmother. H. I sat there with the note balanced across my knee, a mixture of grief and absolution rolling through me like weather. He hadn't asked me to plead with my parents. He'd given me a lawful switch and told me when to flip it. The next folder held everything I'd need to prove the thresholds were already crossed, invoices for 2 years of prepaid in-home care, a printout of appointment confirmations, and copies of emails my parents had sent to the care agency, short, transactional notes that made my jaw clench. One subject line read, "A cancel recurring nurse visits, effective immediately." Another, "We will manage her day-to-day from now on." A month later, a bank statement showed a $15,000 transfer out of Evelyn Carter Long-Term Care Trust to a joint account ending in 4432, the one my parents used for household expenses. A handwritten annotation in Henry's blue ink sat next to it, out of scope. That was sufficient. In Iraq, we called it evidentiary continuity, a paper trail that could walk on its own. I pulled out my laptop at Grandpa's desk and drafted an email to Whitaker and Lowe, the estate firm listed in the directive. I'd met Daniel Whitaker once at Christmas. He'd had the brisk, dry manner of a man who enjoyed clean processes. I attached the scanned documents, the timestamps, and photos from Grandma's room, carefully framed, respectful, but unambiguous, dry lips, unattended medication, the unreachable glass. Then I called. Whittaker. It came the even voice. Mr. Whittaker, this is Captain Emily Carter. I'm at Henry and Evelyn Carter's residence. I'm invoking the successor fiduciary provision per the attached documentation. Grounds: terminated care without replacement, diversion of designated funds, and current neglect. I need immediate injunctions and account holds per the contingency protocol. A measured beat. Paper rustled. I'm reviewing. Captain, these documents are airtight. Your grandfather drafted with precision. Do you have current evidence of your grandmother's condition? I do. A nurse is with her now. I can connect you. That won't be necessary yet. I'm initiating notices to the banks and service providers. Primary fiduciaries will be suspended pending review. Successor authority transferred to you. Expect confirmations within the hour. Thank you. One more thing, he said. Henry spoke of you often. He'll be pleased you call the play without flinching. I exhaled a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. He taught me the playbook. While Whittaker pushed the levers only lawyers can push. I moved through the house like I was clearing a site after a flood. I gathered Grandma's medical files, inventoried her medications, labeled drawers, tossed out spoiled food, and programmed the thermostat to the temperature she liked. The nurse, Yanel, with steady eyes and a voice that could calm a storm, showed me how to lift Grandma without jarring her ribs. We swapped emergency contacts and posted them by the door. My parents' framed vacation photo, cobalt ocean, bright drinks, stared down from the hallway table. I turned it face down and kept working. By late afternoon, emails began to land like small, decisive hammers, assets frozen. Access removed. Successor authority active. Whittaker scheduled a video conference for the next morning. He would be on, so would my parents, connecting from Miami Beach according to the automated invite. I pictured them in a beige hotel room, blinds drawn against the coastal glare, confusion turning to anger as their cards were denied, then to that stark, empty fear when entitlement finds the ground missing beneath it. I didn't savor it. I didn't have space. There was dinner to make, water to offer, a story to read aloud to a woman who loved crosswords and hummingbirds. I spooned vegetable soup into a mug and held it to Grandma's lips, counting slow sips, feeling the fragile weight of her hand curl around my wrist. Her eyes fluttered open, blue, watery, aware for a moment. She whispered. I'm here, I said. I've got you. A hint of a smile. You always did. When she slept again, I returned to the study and opened one more folder, the one labeled A Foundation, Draft. Inside were Henry's notes for a fund he'd never had time to launch, legal support for caregivers, grants for families juggling deployments and elder care, templates for powers of attorney that couldn't be abused by convenience. He'd outlined the mission in bullet points, then crossed them out and tried again, chasing language that felt like him. At the bottom, in different ink, he'd scribbled, a start small. Keep promises. I closed the folder and watched evening settle over the backyard pecan tree. In the distance, a train horn moaned, a low, steady sound that always made this house feel like a waypoint rather than an ending. Tomorrow would be the reckoning. There would be raised voices through tinny laptop speakers, denials, maybe tears. There would be exhibits, inverses stamped cancelled, bank screenshots, bright vacation photos pasted against paramedic reports. And there would be Whitaker's calm baritone reading the clause that ended the argument before it began. But tonight belonged to simple vows. I set a glass of water within Grandma's easy reach. I taped a note above the nightstand that read, "Press this button for help. Yanelle or Emily will come." I sat in the chair beside the bed and took her hand, feeling the faint pulse ticking like a gentle metronome. Legacy isn't money. It's a promise. And promises, kept carefully, make their own kind of music. I let the rhythm carry me until the house exhaled, not with the heavy neglect I'd found the day before, but with something closer to peace. When the phone buzzed again on the kitchen table, another call from Miami, I didn't flinch. I turned the ringer off, closed Grandpa's safe, slid the bookcase back into place, and checked the calendar invite one last time. 9 a.m. Video conference, Whitaker and Lowe, Estate, Thomas and Linda Carter, Captain Emily Carter. I clicked accept. Morning came with the same Tennessee humidity that clung to everything like a damp blanket. I brewed coffee, laid out documents across Grandpa's oak desk, and opened my laptop. The calendar invite blinked at me. Video conference, 9 a.m. Whitaker and Lowe, Estate, Thomas and Linda Carter, Captain Emily Carter. At precisely 8:59, I clicked join. 3 windows opened on my screen. In the first, my parents, crammed together in what looked like a bland Miami Beach hotel room. Their tans were already fading, their expressions twisted into a blend of rage and confusion. My father's jaw was tight, my mother's eyes red-rimmed but defiant. In the second, Daniel Whitaker, the family's estate lawyer. His demeanor as flat as the mahogany paneling behind him. He gave me the faintest nod of acknowledgement, his hands folded neatly on his desk. And in the third window, me, sitting in Grandpa Henry's study, the safe and its arsenal of documents now my shield. The silence didn't last. My father lunged into it, his voice sharp through tinny laptop speakers. "What the hell have you done, Emily? Our cards don't work. The hotel front desk humiliated us. We had to borrow money just to keep the room. Fix this, now." I let him rant. Years in the army had trained me to weather storms without flinching. He jabbed a finger at the screen as though it could reach me. My mother chimed in, shrill and defensive. "You can't just take over. We've been managing everything. Your grandmother was fine when we left. We just needed a break." A break. While Grandma Evelyn lay in that dark room, dehydrated and alone. When they finally ran out of steam, I leaned forward, my voice steady. "This isn't a negotiation. I have executed Grandpa's legal directives. You were named fiduciaries, entrusted with her care. You abandoned that duty. Now it's mine." I clicked share screen and pulled up Exhibit A, an inverse from the home nursing service. A red stamp cut across the page, cancelled, requested BY family representatives. 2 months ago, you terminated her care contract. That alone qualifies as gross negligence under the clause. My father opened his mouth, but I was already displaying Exhibit B, a bank statement from Grandma's long-term care account. I highlighted a line, transfer, $15,000, Evelyn Carter Care Trust Thomas and Linda Carter Household Account. I read aloud, a diversion of funds from a medical trust into your joint account. That is misappropriation. My mother paled, the indignation giving way to fear. Finally, I clicked to Exhibit C, their own Facebook posts. There they were, lounging poolside in Miami, umbrella drinks in hand. The timestamp read 2:14 p.m. On the opposite side of my screen I placed the paramedics' report, arrival at 4:07 p.m., noting Evelyn Carter had been unattended for over 6 hours. The silence that followed was louder than any shouting. My mother began to sob, choking out excuses. We deserved some time away. We worked so hard. I cut her off, my voice like a blade. You deserved nothing. She deserved care. She deserved dignity. You left her with neither. I shifted focus to Whitaker. He cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and began to read from the clause Henry had written years earlier. Upon documented evidence of neglect, abandonment, or misuse of funds by the primary fiduciaries Thomas and Linda Carter, all powers of attorney and control of all assets are to be immediately and irrevocably transferred to the successor fiduciary, Captain Emily Jane Carter. He paused, letting the words immediately and irrevocably sink into the air. This action is binding and non-negotiable. My father's face drained of colour. His bluster collapsed in real time, like a balloon punctured at its seams. He slumped in his chair, staring at the floor. My mother's sobs quieted into shallow gasps. For once, they understood. I ended the call with a decisive click. Their images vanished, leaving only my reflection in the black screen. The silence that followed wasn't heavy or suffocating. It was clean, purposeful. Down the hall, the gentle hum of Grandma's oxygen machine filled the house, steady and alive. That night, sitting beside her bed, I promised aloud, "You will never be abandoned again." And for the first time since stepping off the plane from Iraq, I felt the weight of battle shift into clarity. This was no longer about old wounds or grudges. It was about mission. Tomorrow, I would begin turning Henry's contingency folder into something larger, something that could outlast even me. The house changed rhythm within 24 hours. The heavy, guilty quiet that had met me at the door gave way to purposeful sound. Yunel's calm instructions, a kettle ticking toward a boil, the soft wheeze of Grandma's concentrator keeping time like a metronome. I built a schedule the way we do in field operations. Simple. Visible. Enforceable. Medication log pinned to the fridge. Emergency contacts taped beside the landline. A whiteboard by Grandma's door that read, "A morning, oatmeal plus berries." Afternoon, Edith Piaf playlist. Evening, stories. We leaned into routine. I learned the exact height to prop her pillows so her lungs worked less. I mixed thickened water with lemon until she nodded yes. When pain crept in, I watched her eyes cloud, then cleared at Yunel's careful dose and cool hand on a forehead that had once checked mine for fever before school. Sometimes Grandma drifted, knitting invisible thread through air. Sometimes she was lucid enough to squeeze my fingers and murmur, "You always follow through, Em." I pretended not to cry. Soldiers don't cry, they hydrate. Whitaker's emails arrived in neat bursts. Successor authority confirmed. Automatic payments rerouted. Notices issued to banks and providers. I signed what needed signing, logged what needed logging, and ignored 36 texts from Miami. One read, "We were exhausted, don't be dramatic." I powered the phone off and went back to warming soup. Days accumulated, tender and relentless. I read To Kill a Mockingbird aloud, then Grandma's favorite cookbook headnotes as if they were short stories. We watched cardinals bicker at the feeder. Once, Ryan called from a new number, my brother who'd always floated on charm and the almosts. I let it ring. This season was not for rescuing grown people who didn't want to learn. It was for guarding a woman who had never once asked for anything. When the hospice team joined the rotation, everything softened, even the air. The nurse practitioner, Dr. Keating, spoke to Grandma like she was in the room even when she slept, explaining each step before she did it. She taught me how to read the tiny changes, breathing moving from chest to stomach, the way hands search for blankets they cannot name. Comfort is our mission, as she said, and I believed her. The army had given me many missions. This one was holy. At night I returned to Grandpa's study and shaped the next phase. I spread his foundation, draft notes beneath a brass lamp and mapped them into an operations plan, mission, legal, financial, and care navigation for elder relatives of active duty service members. Criteria: verified deployment or mobilization orders, elder at risk of neglect, fraud, or housing insecurity. Services: emergency grants, pro bono legal intervention, vetted caregiver networks, case management. I could hear Henry's voice as I typed. Start small. Keep promises. I called 3 people. First, Command Sergeant Major, Ret. Paul Ramirez, who had taught me that standards of kindness in uniform. He said, still too polite to switch to my first name. You say where and I'll build the sops. Second, Aver Nguyen, a legal aid attorney in Franklin who scared predatory landlords for sport. I'll take the Eldelore docket, Ishi said. But we do this clean. Intake forms, conflict checks, written scopes. Third, Yunel, because there was no point building anything that didn't put nurses in the room. She blinked at me over the kitchen island, then nodded. We can train families in 2 hours what took me a year to learn the hard way, Ishi said. Let's make the hard parts softer. While the foundation skeleton took shape, I made decisions about the house. I hired an estate service that didn't smell like vultures. We walked room to room with blue painter's tape and a clipboard. I kept the ledger, the fishing lures, Grandma's Sunday hat, the mixing bowls the color of sea glass. Everything else became funding, mansion, boat, the leather recliner my father loved because it felt like success. I signed a listing agreement before guilt could whisper. The agent blinked at the speed, then hustled. On the last afternoon of February, sun poured through the kitchen like honey. Grandma's breathing was light, shallow, content. I sat beside her and told her the plan again, all the way through, how the proceeds from the sale would seed the foundation, how Ramirez would build a training pipeline for volunteers, how Aver would draft the ironclad documents that stopped a conveniencer from becoming neglect. How Yunel would standardize care guides in plain English. I didn't know if Grandma heard my words. But when I finished, her thumb brushed my knuckle. 1, 2, like a tiny stamp of approval. She slipped away the next morning just before dawn, when the birds were still negotiating which tree to use for chorus. I held her hand, counted to 60 after the last breath, and whispered the benediction she taught me as a child, go with peace you carried into every room. Yunel phoned the hospice line. The team moved like a small, respectful tide, attending to what bodies ask of us after the work of living. Grief later. Logistics now. I brewed coffee for the nurses, texted Ramirez and Aver, and then, finally, called my parents. They learned their mother had died from the daughter whose calls they'd ignored until the money dried. My father made a low sound, stunned and small. My mother cried like a siren and asked about flights. I gave them the funeral time and the address and nothing else. Boundaries are also kindness. The service was simple at a chapel in Green Hills. Friends from church, 2 women from Grandma's Bridge Group, the hospice team, and exactly one neighbour who said, Evelyn always took in the mail when we travelled. My parents arrived late, strained and grey. Ryan stood in the back in a too tight suit, unsure where to place his hands. I spoke of bread dough and hummingbirds, of promises kept when no one's watching, of a legacy measured in casseroles delivered and grandchildren defended. When the last hymn faded, I watched my mother glance at the casket as if expecting it to speak her absolution. It didn't. Probate was quick. Henry's architecture made it so. With signatures and certified copies, the house closed above asking. The boat found a buyer who wore wraparound sunglasses, and a wire transfer landed in the new account for the Henry and Evelyn Carter Foundation. I withdrew a single dollar bill, wrote promise across it in pencil, and slid it behind the ledger's cover as a reminder that money was only a tool, never the mission. Then we launched. A cheap website built in a weekend. A 1-page intake form. A P.O. box. Ramirez assembled a bench of volunteers, spouses, reservists, a retired VA social worker who could navigate phone trees like a bloodhound. Aver trained a dozen pro bono attorneys on fast-track guardianship protections and financial abuse injunctions. Yunel filmed 3 short videos, safe transfers, medication basics, and a how to set up a reachable water station. We didn't do everything. We did first steps, fast and well. The first call came from a corporal in Fort Campbell whose mother in Pajiker had a landlord threatening eviction over noise that sounded a lot like dementia. The second came from a petty officer on a destroyer who suspected his grandma's a friend he had been added to her bank account. The third was a text from a staff sergeant I knew only through sand and radio static. Heard you stand up for the ones who stood up for us. My aunt needs you. We moved quietly and precisely. Aver faxed letters that made bullies go soft. Ramirez delivered volunteers with clipboards and checklists. Yunel FaceTimed from our kitchen to someone else's, guiding a niece's hands under an elderly shoulder. Every time we solved one small, stubborn problem, I felt the house in Brentwood breathe with us, as if wood and plaster were relieved to be reproposed. At night I'd sit in Grandpa's chair, ledger open, and balance the day. Not just dollars, but promises, 3 interventions, 1 care plan stabilized, 2 families taught to place the glass within reach. I pressed the pencil into the margin until the page shone. On a rainy Thursday, a padded envelope arrived with no return address. Inside was a Polaroid of Grandma at 20, hair-pinned, standing on a Nashville sidewalk with Henry grinning like he'd won the world. On the back, in blue ink, I recognized, start small. Keep promises. H. No explanation, just the benediction I needed. I tacked the photo above my desk and set tomorrow's tasks. Because grief had given me clarity, and clarity had given me a mission. And missions, I've learned, I simply love wearing boots. Spring in Nashville crept in quietly, the dogwoods blooming while my days blurred into 12-hour stretches of paperwork, calls, and bedside vigils. The Henry and Evelyn Carter Foundation was real now, stitched together from late nights, pro bono hours, and the kind of grit Grandpa always admired. Yet with its first successes came the first cracks of resistance, from family, from neighbors, even from within myself. My parents reappeared, predictably, after weeks of silence. Not with apologies but with demands. They had left voicemails that began angry, then desperate, then syrupy with false concern. One afternoon, as I returned from the hospice center, They were parked in the driveway in Dad's old Lincoln, as if nothing had changed. Emily, and my father said, stepping out, still trying to summon authority in his crumpled polo shirt. We need to talk. You've made things very difficult. Freezing accounts, humiliating us. What do you think this accomplishes? I kept my voice level. It accomplishes what Grandpa wanted. Grandma is safe. That's all that matters. My mother's tone shifted to a whine. You don't understand how much stress we were under. We thought she'd be fine for a few days. We needed time to recover. I pointed at the house. She was 6 hours from death when I walked in. That's what your recovery cost her. They didn't answer. Instead, Dad tried another tactic, flattery. But look at you now, running a foundation, handling money. Maybe there's a way we could guide things. We know people. I almost laughed. The same people who cancelled nurses and siphoned accounts now offering a guidance. I told them firmly, you will have no role. Ever. If you want redemption, start by admitting what you did. Out loud. Until then, leave. Their faces hardened. Dad muttered something about lawyers. But they left, and the gravel crunch of their retreat felt like breathing fresh air. Inside, the foundation was gaining speed. Ramirez built training manuals that looked like field guides, bold fonts, waterproof pages, tabs marked medication, hydration, warning signs. Ava drafted template injunctions that shut down scams before elders lost everything. Yanel began a program she called Comfort Core, teaching volunteers how to sit, listen, and make small spaces feel safe. The first families wrote back with letters, handwritten, shaky, grateful. A Marine in Okinawa. I couldn't sleep knowing Mom was alone. Now she has a team. Thank you. A Navy officer off the coast of Spain. You protected my father from eviction. You protected me, too. Each letter was fuel. But the turning point came when I faced the hardest question yet, what legacy really meant. One evening, I sat in Grandpa's chair with the ledger open. The numbers looked solid. Funds from the house sale, initial donations, careful investments Ava arranged, all balanced. Still, something gnawed at me. Money could sustain us, but it couldn't define us. I thought of Grandpa's workshop, of the way he said, a legacy isn't money, it's a promise. Promises meant people, not accounts. If the foundation was to last, it needed more than my willpower. It needed a family, not by blood, but by choice. So I called them all to the house, Ramirez in his pressed shirt, Ava with her files, Yanel still in scrubs, and even 2 new volunteers who had shown extraordinary drive. We gathered in the study, around the desk that had been the battlefield weeks earlier. This isn't mine anymore, I told them. This is ours. A promise only works if it's carried by more than one set of shoulders. We went around, each voicing what we could give. Ramirez offered discipline. Ava, relentless legal defense. Yanel, the heart of caregiving. The volunteers, fresh energy and perspective. By the end, we weren't just co-workers. We were co-guardians of something larger than ourselves. I felt Grandpa's presence like a weight lifted, not added. For the first time, I wasn't alone. Yet outside, the storm gathered. My parents weren't done. Whispers circled in the neighborhood. Emily cut her parents off. Old family friends stopped waving. A local paper even ran a thinly veiled piece about your estranged heirs and disputed estates. When Aver slid the clipping across the table, I read it twice, then folded it carefully. They want to paint me as cold, EI said. But cold was leaving Evelyn in that bed. Cold was stealing from her account. What we're doing, it's warmth. And it will outlast gossip. Still, I knew confrontation was coming. My parents weren't the type to fade quietly into shame. And I was ready. Because I had soldiers beside me now. Because I had a mission. Because legacy was no longer about what I inherited, it was about what I chose to build. By summer, the foundation's work was steady, measured, and real. We weren't making headlines, but the families who called us didn't care about headlines. They cared about the phone being answered, the rent being paid, the nurse showing up on time. Each case we handled felt like building a sandbag wall against a flood. And yet, while we were stacking protections around strangers, another flood pressed against me, my parents. It began with letters. Thick, self-important envelopes stamped with the logo of a law office in downtown Miami. Cease and desist. Petition for review. Formal request to reinstate fiduciary rights. Ava read them all, her expression flat. They're fishing, she said. They don't have standing. The clause your grandfather wrote is airtight. She filed responses with clinical precision, and each time the matter was dismissed, but like weeds in summer, the letters kept sprouting. Then came the social campaign. My parents had always been skilled at appearances, and now they wielded sympathy like a weapon. Old church friends in Nashville started forwarding me Facebook posts, my mother lamenting about her ungrateful daughter who stole everything while we were grieving. Photos of their faded tans paired with captions like, "We sacrificed everything for our kids." Some repay with cruelty. I didn't reply. I had nothing to prove. Still, the whispers reached me, at the grocery store, at Grandma's old church. A neighbor muttered, families should stick together. Another asked, couldn't you have handled it privately? As if silence were the noble option. As if abandoning Evelyn had been anything but a public betrayal. The confrontation finally came on a humid Thursday. We were holding our first board meeting in the new foundation office, a modest converted duplex in East Nashville. The sign out front was simple: Henry and Evelyn Carter Foundation, promises kept. Inside, the board was deep into reviewing 3 new cases when the door opened without a knock. My parents walked in. They looked worn, smaller somehow, but their eyes burned with the old entitlement. "Emily," my father said, sweeping the room with a glare. "We need to talk. Now." I stood slowly. Behind me, Ramirez's chair scraped back. Ava closed her folder but didn't move. Yunel folded her arms. My new family formed a wall without needing to speak. "This is a private meeting," I said evenly. "You don't have a seat here." My mother's voice cracked with rehearsed heartbreak. "How could you do this to us? To our family? You've turned strangers against us. You've sold our home. You're parading our shame in public." I breathed in, measured. "I didn't do this to you. You did it to yourselves when you left Evelyn alone to die. I just enforced the promises Grandpa made." "You've ruined us," and my father snapped. "Do you even understand what it's like to lose everything you built?" The words struck something deep, but not the way he intended. Because I did understand loss. I'd seen markets burned, children burying fathers, cities gutted by corruption. And I knew the truth. My parents hadn't lost everything. They'd lost access to someone else's everything. You didn't build it, I said, my voice steel. Henry and Evelyn built it. You drained it. And now it's over. Silence spread through the room, thick and electric. My parents stood there, waiting for someone, anyone, to validate their outrage. But no one moved. Finally, Ava spoke, her tone dry as dust. Mr. and Mrs. Carter, unless you have legal documents to present, you're trespassing. I suggest you leave before I call security. My mother flinched as though slapped. My father's lips curled, but he said nothing. For a long moment. We all stayed frozen in that standoff. Then they turned, muttering, and walked out. The door shut with a finality that echoed in my chest. That night, I sat at Grandpa's desk again, the Polaroid of him and Grandma pinned above it. I replayed the confrontation in my head, waiting for guilt, for doubt, for the tremor of second-guessing that had haunted me since childhood. None came. Instead, I felt something like relief. The war was shifting fronts. My parents would keep clawing, but they no longer scared me. The power had already changed hands, not just legally, but spiritually. Legacy wasn't theirs to define anymore. It was ours to carry forward. 2 weeks later, we hosted our first community event, a small workshop in the basement of a Nashville church. Families sat in folding chairs, notebooks on laps, as Ramirez taught them how to set up medication stations, how to post simple checklists by the door, how to make a safety kits for elders who lived alone. Ava explained financial red flags, how to spot when a caregiver suddenly started driving a new car, or when checks went missing. Yunel led them through gentle hands-on training, demonstrating transfers with a volunteer. I stood in the back, watching, listening. Laughter cracked the air when someone fumbled with a gate belt. A woman in her 50s wiped tears, murmuring, I thought I was alone. This was legacy. Not marble houses or vacation photos. Not prestige or appearances. It was knowledge passed hand to hand, protection built from ordinary people refusing to look away. And as the workshop ended, as families lingered to talk and share, I felt the truth settle in me like solid ground. The storm had broken. We were still standing. And we were only just beginning. By autumn, the foundation had grown into something I barely recognized from those first sleepless nights at Grandpa's desk. What began with a whiteboard and a stack of folders now had an office with 2 rooms, a rotating roster of volunteers, and a phone line that never seemed to go silent. Calls came from Kentucky, Alabama, even as far as California. Soldiers and sailors who had once fought beside me now trusted me with the quietest battles of their lives, protecting their parents and grandparents back home. We didn't solve everything. We couldn't. But we kept our promise. No elder was left abandoned when someone reached out to us. My parents, meanwhile, slid further into irrelevance. Their campaign of outrage had fizzled. The lawyer letters stopped. The social media posts shrank from righteous fury to sad pleas. A neighbor told me they'd sold the Lincoln and were renting a small condo in Miami. The empire they thought was theirs had been reduced to nothing but bitterness and excuses. One evening, while reviewing case files, an email popped into my inbox. The sender line read, Linda Carter. My hand hovered over the mouse. For a long moment, I didn't want to open it. But finally, I clicked. It contained only 2 sentences. I'm sorry. We have nothing. I read it twice, waiting for some kind of reaction. Anger, pity, triumph. Nothing came. The words felt distant, like weather reports from another state. For years, I had carried an invisible ledger in my chest, tallying every slight, every dismissal, every forgotten achievement. That ledger was blank now. Their chapter was finished. I archived the message and went back to work. The work itself became my anchor. Ramirez pushed us to adopt military precision, after-action reviews for every case, metrics tracked on spreadsheets that grew by the week. Ava recruited 2 more attorneys, both veterans themselves, to expand our reach. Yunel trained a dozen volunteers in caregiving basics, turning nervous family members into confident advocates. One night, after a long day, I walked past the bulletin board in our office. Pinned across it were thank you notes, photos of families, even a drawing from a child who had written, "A thank you for helping my grandma not be scared." I stopped, staring at that drawing. My throat tightened, not with grief this time, but with something gentler, peace. I thought often of Grandma in those weeks. Her absence was everywhere. But it was no longer heavy. When I read stories to elders in hospice, I felt her smile. When I showed families how to set water within reach, I saw her pale hand brushing mine. She was present in every case we handled, every promise we kept. And Grandpa too. His handwriting in the margins of that old ledger had become more than memory, it was blueprint. Every time I balanced the books, I felt him standing behind me, steady, approving. 6 months after her passing, we held our first official fundraiser. Nothing fancy, a potluck in a community centre, with folding chairs and homemade casseroles. But the room was full. Veterans, caregivers, local leaders, even strangers who had heard whispers of what we were building. I stood at the podium, hands steady, and told them the story. Not the whole story, just enough. About a soldier who came home to find neglect. About promises that had to be kept. About how legacy isn't wealth or comfort, but duty. When I finished, the room rose in applause, not polite but genuine. Donations filled the baskets on the tables. Ramirez clapped me on the shoulder, grinning. Ava raised her glass of sweet tea. Yunel whispered, "They believe." For the first time in years, I believed too. Not in appearances. Not in approval. But in the work. In the mission. That night, back in my small apartment, I sat with a cup of tea and the silence. Not the suffocating silence of neglect, but the kind that feels earned, like rest after a long march. I thought about everything that had led here, the wars abroad, the wars at home, the glass of water just out of reach. Peace wasn't what I expected. It didn't come with trumpets or fanfare. It came with steady breaths, with knowing I had kept the promise. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in a long time, I slept without dreams. Years passed the way Tennessee rivers flow, slow on the surface, fast underneath. The Henry and Evelyn Carter Foundation grew from a handful of volunteers into a network spread across 6 states. Our hotline operated 24 hours. Our intake forms moved online. Our board expanded to include a retired judge, a Navy chaplain, and a nonprofit strategist who could stretch $1 farther than anyone I'd ever met. But through all the changes, the mission never shifted. No elder of a service member would be left behind. We saw everything: fraudulent caregivers draining accounts, landlords threatening eviction, siblings fighting over scraps while the real needs went ignored. And every time, our team stepped in. Sometimes with legal papers, sometimes with hot meals, sometimes with nothing more than presents. We weren't miracle workers, but we were protectors. I carried my grandfather's ledger with me everywhere. Its pages, now brittle, still bore his neat arithmetic. Each time we closed a case, I did a line in pencil, not dollars, but promises kept. By the 10th anniversary of the foundation, the pages were nearly full. As for my parents, they faded like photographs left too long in the sun. They never regained their standing in Nashville. Old friends turned cold. Their Miami condo shrank into a one-bedroom apartment near the airport. The last I heard, my father was working part-time at a marina, my mother giving piano lessons to neighborhood kids. They never came to another fundraiser, never wrote again beyond that single email, I'm sorry. We have nothing. I stopped checking in. There was no malice in it, just distance. Their story had ended for me, and I had no desire to reopen the book. Ryan, my brother, tried a few more ventures. An app, a podcast, a partnership that dissolved after 6 months. Eventually, he called me from a halfway house in Florida, voice raw but humbled. You were right, he admitted. I told him he didn't owe me apologies, only effort. Whether he made that effort was his story to write, not mine. The foundation, though, that was mine. And ours. On our 15th anniversary, we hosted a gathering not in a basement or borrowed church hall, but in a modest conference center in downtown Nashville. Rows of tables lined with families, veterans, community leaders. On the stage behind me, a banner read, "Legacy is a promise." I stood at the podium, looking out at faces young and old. Soldiers in dress uniforms. Nurses in scrubs. Grandmothers holding grandchildren on their laps. Ramirez sat in the front row, his hair silver now but his posture still parade ground straight. Ava leaned back with that same sharp glint in her eyes, satisfied with every victory she'd carved from the lore. Yunel stood near the refreshment table, laughing with a family she'd trained years earlier. I spoke simply. I once came home from war and found neglect where there should have been love. I could have drowned in that grief. Instead, I followed the blueprint left for me, to turn legacy into duty. Tonight, I look around this room and see that duty alive in all of you. Together, we've proven what Henry and Evelyn believed, that a promise kept is more powerful than any inheritance. Applause filled the room. Not thunderous, but steady. Lasting. Later that evening, alone in my office, I opened the ledger again. The last page waited, only a few lines left. I picked up a pencil and wrote, Case #1247. Elder safe. Promise kept. Then I closed it gently. I thought of Grandma Evelyn's hand brushing mine, of Grandpa Henry's quiet lessons in that cedar-scented study. I thought of the soldiers overseas who slept easier knowing their parents were protected. I thought of every glass of water placed within reach. Legacy wasn't marble houses or sprawling estates. It wasn't social status or vacation photos. Legacy was the quiet insistence that someone matters, that someone will not be left alone. I had become the keeper of that legacy. And when my time ended, others would carry it forward. That was enough. I leaned back, letting silence settle over the office. Not the silence of neglect, but the peace of completion. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine life beyond duty, not leaving it behind, but carrying it lightly, like a flag already planted in firm ground. And I knew, deep down, that if Grandpa were here, he'd simply nod and say, "You kept the promise, Em." That's all that matters.